Real short second part of the Vietnam lecture. I want to make sure I get through everything. I had less than a minute, and I don't want to have to speed read. So, long-term effects of Vietnam. Right? Obviously, the first one, most important thing to worry about is physical and psychological damage to soldiers, and I would say to the civilians and people living in Vietnam. PTSD, which we all recognize now as a very intense, mental health issue, was completely ignored. Right? We didn't believe PTSD was a thing until the 80s, and really we didn't start prescribing things or really trying to help people with it until the 90s. We just thought you were mentally weak or something, right? You couldn't handle war or whatever, right? Public shame and mistreatment. We treated returning soldiers very poorly. Some were spit on, bad things like that happened, which sucks. I'm all for, people should spit on Lieutenant Calley or people that did awful things like that, ordering the killing of civilians, but soldiers follow orders, and most of the people that were soldiers then didn't want to be soldiers, and they were drafted. They were forced to go and fight. And we can't blame them for it. We can blame their commanding officers. We can blame our crappy political leadership that got us embroiled in this and wouldn't tell us the truth or wouldn't get out. But blaming the soldiers was ridiculous. And then, of course, the exposure to Agent Orange, which affected their lungs, affected their eyes, affected their skin, and we didn't want to pay for it. Again, another example of every president says they love veterans, they're going to treat them better, and very few actually do. And I would argue that really none of them treat our veterans as well as we should. Vietnam syndrome is something that we talked about as a nationwide thing. So we realized that our country wasn't invincible. We weren't quote-unquote undefeated anymore. Which is, we had lost before, right? Going all the way back to us trying to open up trade in the Mediterranean and losing a war to Tripoli, right? To say the War of 1812 against England, which was a draw, wasn't a win for us. They burned down the White House and all of that. So we weren't undefeated, but since we become a superpower, World War I, World War II, we were pretty close to undefeated, although Korea is going to be a draw as well. The War Powers Act of 1973 was passed, directly aimed at Nixon for waging a secret war, and directly aimed at Johnson for usurping Congress's power. So what this law says is that a president can send troops whenever he wants, but he has to either get a declaration of war or remove those troops within 90 days. Has this worked? No, absolutely it hasn't worked. Come on. We still have troops in like 100 countries right now doing all sorts of things, and we haven't declared war on 100 countries, right? So this is something that needs to be strengthened, right? Congress declares war. We can't just elect a president and say, hey, you get to decide everything, right? That's not how democracy works, right? That's not how, or at least that's not how American democracy is supposed to work. We're supposed to have checks and balances, we're supposed to have co-equal branches and stuff like that, and we need to get back towards that. Anyways, attempts at healing. The voting age at this point was 21. We lowered it to 18 because at 18 you could get drafted. The draft was abolished, so now we have an all-volunteer army. However, there could still be a draft. That doesn't mean that the draft will never come back. When I was 18, I still got a selective service card, which is what they call a draft card, right? We gave amnesty to all the people who avoided the draft, right? The Vietnam Memorial in D.C. was created, and President Clinton will normalize relations with Vietnam in 1995. We trade with them. If you look on the tags for your clothes, a lot of our clothes are stitched together in Vietnam because they don't have any labor laws, and we can pay kids 5 cents a day to do that instead of paying people living wages. So, the U.S. involvement and prestige, though, will be impacted forever, right? So, the War Powers Act allows a president to unilaterally or by himself send troops into a country, but he must receive congressional approval or remove those troops within 90 days. Is that true or is that false? So there's a picture of the Vietnam Memorial in Washington, D.C. Lots of names on that wall of Americans who died fighting over there. A pretty moving memorial. I'd recommend going to it. D.C. is awesome. You can see a lot of cool historical stuff, and this is one thing you should make sure to go see when you are there. Some examples of books to read that I would highly recommend. A Viet Cong memoir is crazy. A Viet Cong soldier wrote it about all of his experiences throughout the war. The Best and the Brightest by David Halberstam, who's a great writer, not just about political or news things, but great basketball writer too. Talks about how our leadership, which was supposed to be the best and the brightest, really wasn't. Some movie recommendations. Perhaps you don't want to read a whole bunch. We got American Experience here on the left. Vietnam and television history. We got Hearts and Minds, which is probably the best documentary made about it, which is super unflinching and doesn't lie at all, which is great. And there's a new one, I don't have a picture up here, by Ken Burns through PBS, just called The Vietnam War. It's on Netflix. I'd recommend that one as well. All right, that's it for Vietnam stuff.